Imagine dying from a simple cut, not from a sword in battle, but from slicing bread. Bread so coarse, so filled with groundstone and fungal spores, that a splinter of grit tears your skin and festers. Infection sets in. There's no penicillin, no antiseptic, only prayers and leeches. Now picture being thrown into prison, not for theft or murder, but for stealing a fish. One fish from a nobleman's pond to feed a starving child. Your child. For this, your hand is cut off. That's the law, and you're only 20-9. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time where your modern survival skills, camping, canning a few wilderness tricks from YouTube would be utterly meaningless. This was not survival, it was submission. Endurance. A slow erosion of the body and soul under forces you couldn't name, and never escape. The average peasant lived on the edge of hunger. If you've ever complained about cafeteria food, or called your mother's cooking bland, you'd be speechless in medieval Europe. Not because you'd be polite, but because you'd be too weak to speak. Forget 3 meals, 2 was a luxury. Bread was the centerpiece. But this was no soft, fluffy loaf. It was dark, dense, gritty, baked from whatever grain was on hand: rye, barley, sometimes oats, ground between stone mills that chipped and cracked, lacing the flour with tiny rocks. Chew too fast, and your molars shattered like brittle. Ivory meat? A once-a-year delicacy, eaten during festivals, or when a work animal had grown too old to be of use. Even then, nobles took the best cuts. You got the rest tripe, intestines, lungs, the scraps modern butchers toss in the bin or grind for pet food. 80% of your calories came from bread and gruel. Dinner was more bread, maybe an onion if you were lucky, a few beans. And if you dared to snare a rabbit from the Lord's land, you might end up swinging from a tree. One man in 13th century England lost his hand for stealing a single fish. Another was hanged for gathering firewood. Survival wasn't about cleverness. It was about obedience. Your days began before dawn and ended long after dusk. Farming, the one job most people had, offered no days off. No weekends, no holidays. Just endless plowing, planting, harvesting, weeding. With a wooden plow and your own blistered hands, you walked up to 20 miles a day, every day, until your feet bled. And when your legs gave out, you dragged yourself across the furrows, because if you didn't sow in time, your family would starve by winter. You weren't alone in this misery. Villages were small, tight-knit, and equally desperate. Houses were little more than mud huts. 400 square feet, if you were fortunate. One room, one hearth, one bed for the whole family, and the livestock. Yes, chickens, goats, even a cow, all lived inside with you. For warmth, for protection, and because manure was precious. Every morning began with the smell of dung and smoke. Every evening ended in the same stench, thicker than before, soaked into your skin and hair and clothes. Wattle and daub walls, mud, clay, straw, and animal waste packed into wooden frames didn't insulate. They leaked, they cracked, they crumbled. The floor was dirt, maybe strewn with rushes if you had them, which you'd replace only a few times a year. In between, rotting vegetables, scraps, and the droppings of animals and children mixed into a compost heap under your feet. There was no chimney. Smoke from the central hearth billowed into the room, blackening your ceiling, your lungs, your eyes. Illumination came from a rushlight, a reed dipped in fat, flickering like a ghost in the gloom. But the worst part wasn't what you breathed, it was what you drank. Rivers and streams were open sewers. Chamber pots emptied into streets. Streets flowed into the water. Wells were often dug near latrines and livestock pens. No one understood contamination. Why would they? Germ theory was 6 centuries away. What seemed clean could kill you. Half the bodies buried in medieval cemeteries show signs of intestinal parasites, worms, flukes, and protozoa. Dysentery. The bloody flux was common, vicious, and nearly always fatal in children. You could die of diarrhea, Many did. So what did people drink? Ale not for pleasure, for survival? Each person, including children, consumed up to 1.5 gallons of weak ale every day. Not the stuff you find in pubs today. This was small beer, low in alcohol, but brewed with boiled water and fermented to kill pathogens. Monasteries produced the best ale, earning vast wealth through secret recipes they guarded like sacred texts, liquid bread, they called it. And sometimes it replaced food altogether. Wine existed, but it was rare, reserved for nobles and clergy. What little reached the peasants was sour, gritty, often mixed with herbs or honey to cover the taste. Fresh milk spoiled in hours, so it was churned into butter or cheese. Occasionally, adults drank posset, a thick mix of ale and milk. It was said to cure fevers. More often, it just induced vomiting. Rainwater might seem like a safe option, but it too was claimed by the Lord. Collecting water from the sky without permission could lead to fines or worse. In some villages, tax collectors monitored barrels. Every drop belonged to someone richer than you. Incredibly, the human body adapted. People raised in these conditions often built immunity to the bacteria in their environment, but travelers, even from the next village, were frequently struck down after a single sip of unfamiliar water. You'd stay hydrated, barely, but never clean. Bathing was a rare ritual. It's not a routine. Full body washes happened 3 or 4 times a year, if that. Heating water required massive amounts of firewood, a resource too valuable to waste on vanity. Some believed bathing was dangerous, that hot water opened the pores to disease. Religious texts warned against the sin of luxury. Saints were praised for their filth. Elizabeth of Hungary washed only her feet. It was considered holy. When people did wash, it meant splashing the hands and face with cold water and rubbing with ash or lye soap. Most homes had no bath. Public bathhouses existed in cities, but were often linked with sex work and infection. Hair teemed with lice. Bodies crawled with fleas. Everyone stank, but no one noticed. When filth is universal, cleanliness is strange. Tooth care, primitive at best. Twigs, salt, rough cloth. By age 40, most people had lost half their teeth. Dentures were fashioned from wood, bone, or human teeth pulled from corpses. To relieve themselves, peasants used chamber pots or simply squatted behind a bush. Townsfolk dumped waste into the street. Castles had garderobes, a small room with a hole. Waste dropped into the moat. Cesspits filled until they overflowed. Then gong farmers arrived with carts and buckets to shovel out the filth. It was the most despised job in Europe. And yet, even this you might endure. You'd get used to the lice, to the rot, to the damp and cold, until winter came. And winter was death. Snow meant famine. By January, food was nearly gone. Caloric intake dropped by half. People burned furniture to stay warm, tore down their own doors to feed the hearth. In places without trees, they burned dried dung or peat. Entire forests disappeared each year, harvested to keep the living from freezing. Wool was the only protection. Layer upon layer, itchy, dirty, never washed. No cotton, no down jackets, just damp wool clinging. To a body that rarely dried, and fires, a double-edged sword, needed one to survive. But a single spark on a straw floor could ignite your entire home. Whole villages went up in flames. No fire brigade, no water pressure. Just screams and smoke and ashdot. You survived by huddling close. Families squeezed together under tattered blankets. You held your child. You prayed. You hoped spring would come, before starvation did. But some winters, spring never came. But let's say you've survived the winter. You've endured hunger, filth, smoke, and pain. You still have all your fingers, maybe even most of your teeth. The sun rises, and the frost retreats. The spring returns, and with it hope, until the coughing starts. It begins with your neighbor, then your son, then you fever. Blackened fingertips, swollen lumps in your armpits and groin. You think it's just another bad year? But within days, your entire village begins to fall silent. The Black Death wasn't the only plague. It was merely the most infamous. Epidemics swept through medieval Europe like wildfires in dry grass. Leprosy, typhus, ergotism, sweating sickness. There were no vaccines, no hospitals, no understanding of contagion. Disease was either a punishment from God or a curse from a witch, and both were your fault. Priests told you to confess. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves bloody to atone for your sins. People blamed the Jews, the lepers, the midwives, the strangers. Mass panic set in. Violence followed. Entire communities were burned alive based on rumors. You might survive the disease. It's only to be killed for carrying it. Doctors, if you could call them that, wore robes of waxed fabric. Bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and long sticks to avoid touching the dying. Bloodletting was common. Leeches, boiled frog legs, dried toad powder. Anything but actual medicine. And when these failed, they turned to relics. The toe of a saint, a splinter of the true cross, the milk of the virgin, snake oil, with divine branding. Wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons. Infected limbs were sawed off without anesthesia. Women gave birth on straw beds, screaming into rags, while men prayed for a boy and buried the mother if things went wrong. They often did, and yet somehow, life continued. Children were everywhere. The average woman gave birth 6 to 10 times. Half of those children died before the age of 5. You'd name your child after a dead sibling. Might even name 2 children the same name, just in case one died. Grief was expected. Not even the nobility were spared. Kings buried sons. Queens wept for daughters. Death made no distinction between the throne and the hut. But life was not all horror. It had moments, quiet ones. Sunrise over a dewy field. A harvest celebration where villagers danced barefoot in the dirt. Music played on lutes and drums. Jugglers and fools performed in the square. Bread was shared. Ale flowed. And for a night, laughter returned. Even peasants found joy. A carved whistle. A game of stones. The birth of a healthy lamb. The first snow. The last frost. A wife's hand in yours. A child's smile in the FIRELIGHT. Medieval people were not just survivors. They were believers. Believers in God. In angels. In justice beyond death. They lit candles for the dead. Said Mass for the lost. Carried relics in pouches and buried secrets in the folds of their prayers. But religion was not comfort. It was control. The church governed everything. Not just your soul. But your calendar. Your sex life. Your punishments. Your thoughts. If you questioned too much, you could be accused of heresy. And in the Middle Ages, heresy was fire. Public executions were routine. Thieves were hanged, traitors were drawn and quartered. Witches were drowned or burned, and the crowds came to cheer. Children watched. Vendors sold food. A man screaming on a pyre was no more shocking than a cow being slaughtered. This was entertainment. And yet, these were the same people who painted cathedrals with angels, who composed haunting chants, who etched prayers into stone so future generations could read them. They lived in a world of paradox, dirt and divinity, horror and hope, filth and faith. But you, the modern outsider, would find no place here. Even your language would betray you. The English of Chaucer, the French of Charlemagne, the Latin of the monks. All alien tongues. You'd be mute in every village. You couldn't read the signs, you couldn't pray in their words, couldn't ask for help. And even if you did, who would believe you? You appear in strange clothes, speak like no man, possess no land, no papers, no name. They'd say you were a spy, or a sorcerer, or worse. The devil himself, in 1321, traveler from the east was lynched because his accent bewitched the horses. In 1379, a woman was drowned because she wore shoes no one recognized. A man who drew a map from memory, showing distant lands, was accused of necromancy. He was hanged. Knowledge was not power. It was suspicion. And forget technology. Your phone is dead. Your watch doesn't tick. Your matches won't light damp wood. Even if they did, fire was sacred. Only blacksmiths, monks, and noble kitchens kept flame without suspicion. Start a fire in the woods, and you'd be hunted. You are not a time traveler. You are a threat. So could you survive the Middle Ages? Not for long. Because the truth is, survival isn't about strength. It isn't about skills. It's about belonging. You with your knowledge, your soft hands, your vaccinations, your allergies, your disbelief, your nostalgia, you don't belong here. You never did. You're not built for this world. But they were. They who buried children and woke to till the fields. They who chewed bitter roots with broken teeth and sang songs while threshing wheat. They who feared devils but fed strangers. Who bled from the gums and still gave thanks. Who lived short, brutal lives but called them blessed. They survived. You'd be dead in a week. You think you've seen cruelty, but medieval justice was a theater of pain. There were no fair trials, no jury of peers, no rights read aloud. If you were accused, your fate was already sealed, not by evidence, but by ordeal. Trial by fire, trial by water, trial by combat. Imagine this. You're told to plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Then you wait 3 days. If your hand blisters, you're guilty. If it heals clean, you're innocent. God's judgment, they called it. A divine court with no appeal, or you're bound and thrown into a river. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty and burned as a witch. Either way, you die. And yet, they believed in justice. Not justice as we know it, but a cosmic balance between sin and suffering. If your crop failed, it was because someone sinned. A child died. It was because someone lied. And if your cow gave sour milk, someone nearby was consorting with the devil. Fear was constant. Suspicion, a way of life. Even love was shadowed by consequence. Marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival economics, joining of families, land, and wombs. You didn't marry for love. You married because your father arranged it, because your dowry was accepted, because your sister died, and someone had to bear the next child. Women had few choices. They could marry, they could enter a convent, or they could starve. Their bodies were not their own, not in childbirth, not in law, not in death. Widows were often forced to remarry or sent to nunneries. Female knowledge, herbalism, midwifery, astronomy was feared, hidden, or punished, and still. They endured, they loved, secretly, fiercely, through letters, glances, a lock of hair. Tucked into a pouch, there were ballads of lovers, torn apart by war, by class, by the church. Tragedy was not new. Romance was never safe. Even the highborn were not exempt from pain. Kings were murdered by their own brothers. Queens poisoned by ambition. Knights slain in muddy ditches far from glory. Castles burned. Thrones changed hands not by election, but by betrayal. Power meant constant fear. You slept in armor. You trusted no one. Even your food had to be tasted before you ate. And when death came, as it always did, you hoped your name would be remembered, not your deeds. Your name. That someone would pray for your soul. That a monk would record you in a ledger. That a stone cross might one day stand over your bones. That your existence would not dissolve completely, because in the Middle Ages, forgetting was. The final death, and what of your soul? This was not an age of atheism. Everyone believed in something. Saints walked among men. Demons whispered at night. Ghosts lingered in corners. Purgatory was real. Hell, even more so. The dead were never truly gone. Their remains were sacred. Their relics, powerful. Bones of martyrs were paraded through towns. Skulls rested in golden reliquaries. Blood of saints was said to heal the sick. The line between the spiritual and physical was not blurred. It was erased. And in that world of unseen forces, survival meant submission, not to man but to mystery. You woke at sunrise to the sound of bells. You prayed in Latin you didn't understand. You fasted, confessed, obeyed. And still you feared. You feared wolves, witches, war, famine, fire, the devil, and most of all, silence. The eternal silence that came after death. So again, could you survive the Middle Ages? You, who carry your trauma like glass, who fear hunger after 3 skipped meals, who tremble at loneliness, who rage at injustice. Could you bear their world where none of those things were exceptional, where pain was as common as dirt? Could you survive a century without choice, without comfort, without hope? Maybe you'd last a day, a week, if you were lucky. But to truly live in the Middle Ages, to belong, you'd need to forget everything you know, your rights, your dreams, your sense of control, and maybe that's the real horror, because they weren't weaker than us. They weren't ignorant. They were resilient beyond imagining. What they endured would break most of us, and yet they sang. They built cathedrals, they wrote epics, they raised children in a world teetering on the edge of apocalypse. They survived, not because they were monsters, but because they had no other choice. And now, we walk over their bones. We live in the world their suffering made possible. Every paved road, every coin, every law, every name was paid for in their blood. They never knew you, but you owe them. Every breath, every right, every comfort. If this opened a door in your mind, so ask again. Like it. Could you survive the Middle Ages? You won't have to. Subscribe for what they never did.